here today, making time on your Sunday. My name is Phil. I'm based in Madison, Wisconsin. It's cold here, but bright and sunny. Today's meeting is organized by Tempest. I recognize most people on the call, but if you haven't been to a Tempest meeting before, we're a network of revolutionary socialists based in the United States. When people contribute in the discussion, maybe they'll introduce themselves and say where they're speaking from. But we got people from, even with this small group, we got people from around the country on it. Today's meeting is about the strike wave that is currently going on in the United Kingdom, we have a mini revival of labor activism in the United States. It's much bigger what is happening in the UK today, and it'll be great to hear something about that and maybe draw some of the parallels and some of the lessons that we can learn from what is happening. We're really pleased to have Ian Allinson with us today. Ian is a longtime workplace activist in the United Kingdom. He's led a number of strikes, including the first national strike in the IT industry in Britain. A few years ago, he stood for General Secretary of Unite, which was Britain's biggest union. And he has just published a book called Workers Can Win, A Guide to Organizing at Work. It came out from Pluto. It's on sale right now, I believe. So it's a good time to grab a copy. And it's a good time because of what is happening right now. I told Ian the other day that he's published the right book at the right time. And he's currently on a book tour in Britain. I don't know how many places he's visited, but quite a few, and getting a great response to his guidebook. And Ian is a member of RS21, Revolutionary Socialism in the 21st Century, a group of socialists in Britain, which has very similar politics to the Tempest Collective. So thanks for being here today, Ian. I think Ian's going to speak for about 20 or 25 minutes. Do you want me to give you let you know when you've got a few minutes left?
Yeah, that would be helpful. Maybe 5 minutes left, something like that.
Sounds good. And then after Ian has spoken, we'll have plenty of time for questions, comments, and discussion. So take it away, Ian.
Thanks, and hi everybody. I guess I'll just add slightly to the introduction. One of my main roles at the moment is I sort of take a lead on coordinating strike solidarity for Manchester Trades Council, which is a kind of umbrella group for trade unions in Manchester. So that I've been doing that for a few years, but it's got kind of busy over the last year. Yeah, that's good to talk about. So what I'm going to try and cover is, first of all, a bit of the political context, what's going on here. Secondly, looking at the current strikes, what's happening at the moment. Thirdly, a bit about how we got here, and then I'm going to end with some of the challenges that we're facing, because I guess that might feed into discussion and connections with the US context as well. So starting with the political context, we've unfortunately still got the Tories in office, and the Tory party here has traditionally pursued kind of ruling class interests, but relied on the support of the middle class and some right-wing workers to get themselves elected. Around Brexit, the kind of interests of the ruling class and their voting base diverged quite significantly. The Tories have been struggling with challenges from the right, which were threatening their ability to win seats, around figures like Nigel Farage, who I suspect you've come across with his links with Trump. And Boris Johnson pursued a populist agenda, right-wing populist agenda, to win the election back in 2019. And it was tolerated by the ruling class because it broke an impasse where there'd been the vote for leaving the EU, but then an inability to actually resolve what that meant in practice. So even though Brexit wasn't something the majority of the ruling class wanted, they kind of went along with his plans. But once he'd broken that impasse, he was really left with no particular plan for British capitalism as to how to move forward. He relied on trying to pursue culture war issues, anti-migrant racism, transphobia, and so on, to try and prop up support. But he handled the COVID crisis disastrously, leading to huge numbers of unnecessary deaths, and faced scandal after scandal, eventually leading to him being toppled by his own party. And then we had Liz Truss taking office with no mandate from the public whatsoever, just a replacement from within the Tory membership, experimenting with an even more right-wing populist approach, borrowing to spend, and that spending openly being to help the richest, and arguing for a kind of trickle down to the rest of the population. Deeply, deeply unpopular. And the Tories were already in trouble with that when they had a mini budget which incensed the money markets, saw them really put enormous pressure on the government, pushing up the cost of government borrowing enormously, which put pressure on for rising interest rates, and led to a complete collapse in Tory support, as well as boosting opposition. So that market rebellion played an important role in bringing her down, as well as opposition from below. So we've now got our third Tory Prime Minister in quite a short space of time, Rishi Sunak, who's trying to appease the money markets with an austerity programme, budget cuts, increased taxes, and so on, and trying to have a degree of stability about government after the chaos of recent months with the different chancellors and prime ministers that we've had. Having said that, to get that stability, he's having to do U-turns all over the place, having to retreat when under pressure to try to avoid unrest within his own party and pressure from below. And this isn't fixing the Tories' problems. They're still, they have recovered slightly from the depths of what they faced under Liz Truss, but they're still 25% behind in the polls, which is just staggering. And they still have no plan for British capital beyond the austerity plan to try to appease the money markets. On the other side of the fence, we have the Labour Party, and Jeremy Corbyn had inspired a lot of people with his leadership, but Corbynism really defeated by Johnson's 2019 victory. His successor, Keir Starmer, was elected on the promise of having the same policies, but being competent. The allegation was that Corbyn hadn't been. But ever since he's elected as Labour leader, he's been rapidly ditching those policies, really focusing on Labour proving itself to be a responsible B team for managing the British state, even when the policies he's pursuing are unpopular, and really hoping to win an election by default as the Tories mess up more and more and more. He's also mounted a really quite intense witch hunt of the left within the Labour Party. So Jeremy Corbyn himself has been denied the whip, so he doesn't sit as a Labour MP in Parliament at the moment, but Corbyn isn't prepared to break with Labour. We've seen a mass exodus from Labour as part of the witch hunt. They expelled one of the key leaders of the Bakers Union here, who'd been a Labour Party member for many decades. That led to the Bakers Union disaffiliating from Labour, quite a significant break. And in the last week, they've expelled Martin Mayer, who's a leading lay member activist in Unite, former executive member and a leader of the left within the union. And they've also expelled Andrea Egan, who's the president of UNISON. So those are the two biggest unions in Britain, both seeing leading activists being expelled from the Labour Party. This is clearly contributing to reducing Labour's grip on the unions. I still think there's relatively small potential for any kind of split in Labour immediately, but it does mean that appeals to stop any kind of resistance to governments and employers to keep things nice and quiet for Starmer to get in, or if Starmer does get in, seem very unlikely to get much traction and have much impact amongst rank and file workers. So in the absence of any real opposition from Labour, there's been a bit of an upsurge in other forms of resistance. So we've seen the launch of the Don't Pay campaign, which is focused on trying to organise mass non-payment of energy bills, energy price rises being one of the key components of the current cost of living crisis in Britain, as in so many other countries. That's got around 250,000 people pledged to not pay, and they're planning to go ahead with the bill strike from the 1st of December, though it's unclear how solid that support really is at the moment. And so that may or may not come to much, but it certainly has contributed to worrying the energy companies and the government. We've had a coalition called Enough is Enough launched by some of the kind of softer left forces.
I have a question.
So including the Communication Workers Union, which organises Royal Mail and telecoms workers. And that's attracted huge.
I have a question.
Perhaps we could leave questions until I finish talking, if that's okay.
Yeah, we'll have question period afterwards.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So far there's been relatively little opportunity to participate in that, so it's felt very top down to people, and there's a real risk of missed opportunities with that. And thirdly, I'd highlight the Organise Now campaign, which is modelled on the Emergency Workers Organising Committee, EWOC, over in the US, trying to provide a kind of quick response and some immediate support to workers trying to organise. So that's some of the political context. Moving on to the current strikes. The government stopped official statistics for strikes being produced in Britain, which is quite remarkable. They think strikes are important enough to continually legislate to make them harder and harder to carry out, but not important enough to actually get any facts. But it's still clear that there's been a big increase in strike activity. Just in the coming week, I'm aware of strikes in the railways, buses, housing, refuse collection, an oil refinery, landscape gardeners, Royal Mail, which if people don't know the scale of Royal Mail here, it handles around 40% of parcel deliveries in the whole country, as well as letters. So really quite significant. Parts of government, schools, university, colleges, shop security guards, a number of factories in manufacturing. So quite a broad range of strike activity just in the next week that's planned. We've had a vote to strike from the Royal College of Nursing, which is remarkable. This is a union that hasn't really seen itself as part of the Labour movement. It's not affiliated to the TUC, our kind of umbrella organisation for unions. It's never had a strike in England before. It has recently had its first strike in Northern Ireland, and that's hundreds of thousands of nurses potentially going up and voted to strike. We've had recently had a strike vote by quite a large number of government employees. So there's a lot of activity, strike activity happening. One of the developments I think is really interesting is that visiting other people's picket lines only a few years ago was something only a few kind of Labour movement anoraks indulged in, but it's become something that's much more common. Quite broad layers of the left, including a lot of the people who, younger people who backed Corbyn, getting involved in trying to give support and solidarity for strikes. I think that's fantastically exciting. We've also seen developments in the climate movement, where Extinction Rebellion have created a Extinction Rebellion Trade Unionists group, which has been doing some great solidarity work. And even XR itself, which hasn't always been exactly pro-worker, sometimes quite moralistic, has put out fantastic solidarity with the Forley oil refinery workers who are in dispute again. So, a group of workers who quite often environmentalists would have taken quite a hostile attitude towards. So that's an exciting development as well. There've been some joint strike rallies and marches, but the coordination so far, and I'll come back to this in the last section of my talk, has been relatively limited. But we are seeing new links being made between different groups of workers and strikers, and strengthening of links as well. And that's really, really important for the future. So a little bit more about how we got here. Inflation in Britain is currently running at 14.2%, which is the highest it's been in very many years. We've also got a tight labour market, low unemployment, lots of vacancies. So if you like, the high inflation is putting pressure on workers that they need to fight, otherwise they'll see a big cut in living standards. The tight labour market is reducing the risk of going on strike. People are more confident they could get another job, or more confident their employer won't want to sack them anyway. We've also had a big effect from the inspiration of the strikes that have happened. And I think the key development here was the first strike by the main rail union, the RMT, in I think it was June. And when that took place, people tracked that searches on Google for joining a union just went through the roof. So after all these years of unions being seen as not really relevant to most people, people seeing the potential power that workers have when we stick together. And I think the other factor we shouldn't neglect is the many, many years of accumulated grievances that this current conjuncture comes on top of, and really finding an outlet through that current situation. So what was the kind of trajectory of how the strike wave developed? I mean, I think we have to start really with COVID. So when the pandemic began, it was impossible to have lawful strike action in Britain, because we have to have postal ballots for strikes here. And the company that runs the postal ballots closed down because of the pandemic. So it's just impossible to run a ballot. We saw a small flurry of unofficial action around COVID, people taking action over safety and sometimes over the other issues as well, but it really didn't break through. Once the restrictions it put in place to try to protect us from COVID were eased slightly, you then saw the beginning of a growing number of local disputes, relatively small disputes, often a few hundred workers here or there, rather than big national ones. And as inflation started to pick up, that really accelerated, and those local disputes often getting wins, or at least significant improvements compared to what was on offer prior to the dispute. And then we saw the disputes on the railway and in Royal Mail kick off, and those were the first two big national disputes that really broke through into the headlines in a way that the local ones often hadn't. Those disputes are still ongoing, not resolved, and I'll come back to some of the issues with those disputes later. There've also been, in some ways, maybe this is a bit more of an indication of the wider mood in the working class, a flurry of little wildcat strikes as well. So there's been a tradition in Britain of having quite a lot of wildcat action in construction, where it's not practicable in most cases to have lawful strike anyway. So people have a bit of a tradition of taking unofficial, unlawful action. But we also saw some sit-ins at Amazon warehouses. We saw quite near where I live a food factory that was not unionised. Worth saying, sorry, the wildcats at Amazon were not organised by any union. They were fairly spontaneous, by which we mean that it wasn't visible, obvious organisation. Clearly there was organisation there. But up the road from me, this food factory, one of these examples of a kind of workplace that you're told is unorganisable. I think there were 50 different nationalities working there. They were working shifts, very high labour turnover, all the barriers to organising, and yet they pulled off a strike for 2 or 3 days and won some demands. And when I went up there talking to some of the workers, some of them who'd been on strike didn't know what a union was, never mind being a member of one. So really quite exciting that the idea of striking is catching on and spreading in that way. We've also seen some small but significant disputes in the docks. Liverpool docks, dockers won their dispute recently. The biggest dock, Felixstowe, still has an ongoing dispute that hasn't yet been resolved. And there are more very big ballots in the pipeline, as well as lots of smaller ones, including lots of health workers in schools, firefighters, are some of the bigger ones that are currently going on. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a picture of the trajectory that we've seen to build up to the current level of strikes. So finally, I want to talk about some of the challenges. So I mentioned that many of the smaller strikes are winning quite a bit, not always matching inflation over pay, but certainly getting much bigger pay rises than were the employers wanted to concede. But the bigger disputes are proving much, much harder to win. In some cases, it's clear that the government is blocking resolutions to the disputes, even where they aren't officially public sector employers, like on the railways, where the government stands behind the employers, and they're planning yet more anti-union legislation, particularly targeting transport workers, to try to require them to provide a minimum level of service. So the union would be responsible for trying to get its own members to scab on their own dispute. Absolutely appalling. And the anti-union legislation is already having an impact. The Communication Workers Union called off some of the strikes in Royal Mail under the threat of an injunction from the employer. In those big disputes, it's quite common that the union leaders aren't really articulating a very clear plan to win. So how they're going to put enough pressure on to get the outcome people want. We've had action suspended with quite weak reasons being given. I mean, for example, when the Queen died, quite a lot of action was called off. And, you could make an argument that said, the action would be overshadowed in the news because that was just obsessed with the royal family and so on at the time. But no, the argument they put forward was it was out of respect for the dead monarch and so on. So really reinforcing more reactionary positions rather than just accommodating to them. Similarly, we've had action called off just because there are talks going on, rather than a much stronger position would be to keep the action until there's a resolution. Coordination between strikes. I mean, the TUC Congress did vote to coordinate strikes, but the coordination's been quite patchy so far. And it feels as if some of the people at the top of the unions are treating each dispute as if it's an individual trade dispute in its own right, that they're trying to win against the individual employer, and kind of missing the fact that the government is standing behind most of the employers, and they're going to have to create a crisis for the government if we're going to get a win in these disputes. And there's one of the I guess problems with that lack of a clear plan to win is the action that's being called is often quite limited, a few days here and a few days there, rather than a level of action that's likely to get results. Now, there are problems with holding more action. So particularly for the rail and post unions, they can't offer any strike pay. And there's some discontent amongst their members about this. They contrast it with Unite, one of the bigger unions that offers £70 a day strike pay to all strikers, for example, or UNISON offers slightly less, but similarly quite substantial strike pay. But one of the reasons is that these strikes are involving almost all of these unions members. So to take Unite as an example, it boasts a strike fund of about £40 million, but if its million members all went on strike at the same time, that would be £40 each. It wouldn't go very far. So it's just not possible for these unions to provide meaningful strike pay when nearly their whole membership is out at the same time. And that really coincides with some of the problems we've got, thanks to having had decades with low levels of strikes. So the kind of grassroots traditions of how we fundraise and deliver solidarity for strikes, about people taking collections around their workmates, doing levies in workplaces, organising delegations of strikers to tour around workplaces to raise support, those kind of things that perhaps a few decades ago would have been fairly standard stuff for militants in the labour movement, almost completely forgotten as traditions now, and people relying much more on official strike pay and donations from union branches rather than actually involving workers in providing that solidarity. And it's one of the, I think, the biggest problems with those strikes, that the leadership is on the one hand under pressure not to call much action because members are worried about money, but they're not actually giving a lead as to push forward systematic fundraising that could enable a higher level of action to be taken. So that is undermining the potential for success in those bigger disputes. I'd argue that we've got a bit of a race against time to build up healthy traditions of rank and file solidarity that can raise money, and also that can defy anti-union laws even when their leaderships won't. And part of the reason I say that's a race against time is Britain's already in recession. We do still have a tight labour market, but that's clearly beginning to ease a little now. We're starting to see the number of vacancies come down. And if we start to see significant numbers of job losses, clearly the government and the Bank of England are trying to accelerate the moves into recession, generate some unemployment, try and weaken workers' bargaining power. So we need to build up the habits of winning and the habits of solidarity as quickly as possible while we're in this favourable situation with a tight labour market. And of course, if we can, then if there are job losses, we could see a militant response to those job losses rather than having the effect of them dampening down the strike wave before it's really got going and we've achieved some really big wins. So the stakes at the moment feel incredibly high for delivering wins in some of those really big pivotal disputes.
Thanks so much, Ian, for that great overview of what is taking place in Britain right now. So we have plenty of time for